Everybody. Today we're going to begin Unit 4 notes, which starts in Chapter 14. Chapter 14 really begins with, the entire unit has to do with what's a period of time referred to the antebellum period. The antebellum period is the period of time leading up to the Civil War. So we're going to see a lot of things happen very rapidly in this short period of time where people go from being friendly and amicable and getting along to literally killing each other, brother versus brother. So it'll be interesting because we can maybe somewhat be able to relate some of the things that are happening today and with what happened over 100 years ago. So hopefully you can make those connections for yourself. I'm not going to make any political statements whatsoever. Just going to point out some historical coincidences. All right, so go ahead and open up your notes, and we will begin Unit 4 in Chapter 16. And once again, good job on your Unit 3 test, guys. Super proud of you. Way to go. Okay, so if we look back to the dawn of our nation, when our republic was first born, and we talk about slavery, people like Thomas Jefferson, a lot of our founding fathers owned slaves. But swept up in the idealism of the American Revolution, many of the Southern leaders, including Thomas Jefferson, were openly talking about freeing their slaves, while others were not willing to free their slaves, but even predicted the death of slavery as they believed it would become unprofitable, which would speed up its demise. But ultimately, with Eli Whitney and the invention of the cotton gin in 1793, all those predictions are scrambled and they're really scrapped. So, his invention made the wide-scale cultivation of cotton very profitable, and so it really created an insatiable demand for labor in the South. So it chains the slave to the cotton gin for all time. As you can see, you have, look at this political cartoon. This is a bale of cotton wearing a crown, King Cotton. This is a wealthy plantation owner, and he's paying homage to the king while stepping on the backs of slaves. Okay, so as time passes on, the Cotton Kingdom develops into a huge, really kind of an agricultural factory. Quick profits were being drawn out by many planters, cultivating large, vast tracts of cotton. Even in the North, northern shippers reached a large part of the profits from the cotton trade, as they're the ones transporting the goods to England and other places beyond. So the prosperity of both the North and the South really rested on the bent backs of Southern slaves. Cotton accounted for half the value of all American exports after 1840, meaning of half the things that we exported, cotton accounted for half the value. So it was an extremely profitable industry by 1840, and even more after that. So it's called King Cotton, and because it's a very powerful thing. It's a powerful monarch indeed. People lived and died with cotton in the South, not to me in particular, slaves. So, obviously, life under the lash in the South was not something that was a pleasant thing, to say the least. But the economic structure of the South became increasingly monopolistic. Small farmers had to continually sell their holdings to more prosperous neighbors to their north or the west, and the big got bigger and the small got smaller as a result of this plantation system. And it created a lot of financial instability in the plantation system, as there was a temptation to over-speculate, meaning purchasing land for more than it's actually worth. So there was a heavy investment of capital money in land and in slaves in the South. And you just never know what could happen. Like, it was a very volatile industry. A slave may deliberately injure themselves, run away, die of disease. Entire slave quarter could be wiped out by disease, or in some cases even struck by lightning, and you lose your entire investment, which is my opinion, is secondary to the loss of life. But that's how people were seen. That's how people saw these slaves. So, cotton in the South, it was a one crop economy, and the price of cotton was at the mercy of world conditions. And this is the whole system discouraged healthy diversification of agriculture. The South rejected manufacturing, and they kind of put all their eggs in one basket. So it's kind of like West Virginia. We put all our eggs in the coal basket, and the coal's pretty much gone now, and things are not great here. So whereas if other places that have a diverse economy and other things that they can rely on, and not just one thing, they're able to make it and have a population of people with success. So that's just kind of a small microcosm of what life was like in the South. All right. In these pictures, one's actually a photograph, show the severe atrocities of life, and we're going to look a lot at those as we continue on. Now, I don't want you to think everybody in the South owned slaves. Only a handful of Southern whites lived in these large pillared mansions like you see in old television shows, most people in the South were just poor white folks. Okay, about 1/4 of white Southerners owned slaves, so that's 25%. Very few people actually owned slaves or belonged to a slave-owning family. Now, the smaller slave owners that did not own a majority of the slaves, but they made up the majority of the masters, were small farmers. So if you did have a family and you did own a slave or two, or perhaps even a slave family, your lives probably resembled more like the lives of a small farmer in the North than that of a Southern planter aristocrat. You lived in very modest farmhouses, sweated right alongside your slaves in the cotton fields, laboring just as hard as your slaves did. In some cases, you may have even eaten dinner at the same table with them. But the majority, the slave owners in the population pyramid, most people in the South owned no slaves. They were too poor. Not to mention the people that lived in the back country, the mountain valleys of western Virginia, Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, the Appalachia area, as there was not a great ability to even grow cotton because the geography of the area was not conducive for growing cotton. Cotton does not grow well in the mountains. So these were subsistence farmers. They raised corn and hogs, not cotton. And much like today, they lived pretty isolated lives, punctuated periodically by socializing at religious camp meetings that would be held from time to time. But these poor white people became known as hillbillies or clay eaters or crackers. They were often described as listless, shiftless, lazy. But later investigations into many of our own ancestors show that they were not simply lazy, but sick, suffering from malnutrition or parasites, especially hookworm from unclean drinking water and improperly cooked food. Now, so all these white people who are poor, they have no direct stake in the preservation of slavery, yet they were some of the most stout defenders of the slave system. So why do you think that would be? These people that have no money, no ability to buy slaves, yet they defend the slave system. Well, it's because of the American dream. It's the carrot on the stick. It's ever dangling before them, where they have the hope of making it and perhaps buying a slave or two in their own lifetime. The idea of upward social mobility. Also, they took fierce pride because they were extremely racist, and their race was the only thing societally that they had over slaves, because their lives were pretty terrible. They had nothing. They lived in squalor, and their perceived racial superiority would be watered down if the slaves were freed. So they felt as though at least they outranked someone in status, and so thus even though it's economically illogical for them to support slavery, but the logic of racism in their own mind was really bolstered their favoritism towards slavery to make them feel like they're pulling themselves up the social ladder by putting others down, if that makes any sense. And you can kind of see that, with racism does exist today, and you can see that throughout our country, particularly in places like Appalachia. Okay, so moving on, another group of people. We've talked about the wealthy aristocrats. We know that there's manufacturers and factory workers in the North, small farmers in the North. There's also a group of free blacks, and they lived a very precarious existence. By the beginning of the Civil War, there was about 250,000 free blacks living throughout the United States. And in the upper South, places like Virginia and Maryland, the free black population traced its origins to, emancipation by revolutionary ideals. People like Thomas Jefferson freeing their slaves when they die. Many of these free black people were mulattoes. Now, mulattoes is just a person of mixed race, okay, and they were mainly the emancipated children of white planters and his black mistress. So throughout the South, they had lived also a very precarious existence because they didn't fit in with either group. White people did not accept them because they were black, and black people didn't accept them because they were white. So they had a very isolating time. Some free blacks were able to purchase their freedom with earnings from labor after hours, or many free blacks owned property. Some free blacks even went on to own slaves themselves. But the free blacks were really kind of a third race. They were vulnerable from both the other races. They were constantly vulnerable by being hijacked into slavery. They didn't constantly have their papers with them, and even if they did, the papers could just be destroyed and be sold back into slavery. A lot of states, particularly in the North, free blacks were unpopular because of racism, and several states forbade free blacks from entering, and most denied them the right to vote. Some barred these free blacks from attending public school. They were hated by the poor pick and shovel Irish immigrants for whom they competed for jobs. So it's, much of the agitation in the North against the spread of slavery in the new territories it grew out of race prejudice, not humanitarianism. It had nothing to do with them seeing them as equals. It was just they didn't like the idea of racial prejudice. Anti-black feeling was growing stronger in the North, in fact, than it was in the South. So enter this guy named Frederick Douglass. He was a very gifted and eloquent former slave from Maryland. He worked in Baltimore, and he was a skilled laborer, and his master would take his wages. Frederick Douglass worked in the harbor, and he was able to take boats and seal them up to make them watertight. So it's a pretty skilled position. But he became an escaped slave and an abolitionist. He's self-educated, a great speaker. He several times was beaten and mobbed by people of the North. So he was not the most popular figure amongst white people, but he was a powerful force for good and movement and a force for abolition. Okay? All right, now we've talked about slavery. We've talked about how if you owned just a couple slaves, if a white family owned a couple slaves, you probably worked beside them. Well, the majority of slaves worked on plantations, okay? And plantations were, this is if you were a slave on a plantation, you lived in society's basement, and about 4 million black slaves lived this existence by the outbreak of the Civil War. So slavery grew in America not from imports, not from bringing new Africans to the United States, but from natural reproduction. In many cases, this natural reproduction was not very natural. It was planned, almost a form of eugenics, taking your strongest male slave and pairing them with your strongest female slave and forcing them to make babies. So, above all, planters regarded slaves not as people but as investments, in which they had sunk nearly $2 billion in by 1860. So slaves were the primary form of wealth in the South, and as such, they were cared for as any asset would be by prudent capitalists. Now, I'm not saying they treated these slaves kindly. I'm saying that they wanted to see them. They wanted to get their money's worth out of them. If you understand what I'm saying, it's really sad. But they were sometimes spared dangerous work, like putting a roof on a house, or blasting a new road through a mountain. Those types of dangerous jobs were often given to wage-earning Irish laborers, as they would if the Irishman died, you just simply go find another Irishman and you keep on working. But if you lost your slave, it would be a significant financial expense. So, the Irish were much more seen as expendable. If you were a slave woman, it was not uncommon for you to bear 13 to 14 children in your lifetime. Many women that produced 10 children were promised their freedom whenever they had 10 children. White masters all too frequently would force their attentions on to female slaves, which created there was a sizable mulatto population fathered, most of which remained as slaves, some of which were freed. Not to mention, the evil sight of the slave auction was very brutal. The open selling of human flesh under the hammer, sometimes alongside cattle and horses, is one of the most revolting aspects of slavery. On the auction block, slaves were sold, separated with distressing frequency, usually for economic reasons. If a planter goes bankrupt, they'll sell the slaves off into different directions, dividing the property up. It's a great psychological horror. Abolitionists, people who wanted to see slavery ended, decried these practices. People like Harriet Beecher Stowe seized the emotional power into the heart of the plot of Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it's a very, very horrible situation. White Southerners would often romanticize about the happy life of the singing, dancing, banjo strumming slaves, but slaves didn't really live these happy lives. Now, obviously, your conditions are going to vary greatly from region to region, whether you live on a large plantation or a small farm. You may have a good, kind master, or you may have an evil one. So not all slave experiences are the same, but regardless, if you were a slave, you're going to live a life of hard work, ignorance, and oppression. You're not going to be taught anything. You're going to work dawn to dusk in the fields under the watchful eyes. You're not going to have any civil rights. You're not going to have any political rights. You're not going to have any protections. Even what protections you did have, like some states would not allow for children under the age of 10 to be sold away, but those laws were difficult and rarely enforced, since slaves were unable to testify in court or even have their marriages legally recognized. So, beatings were very common. Slaves that were particularly strong-willed were sent to people called breakers, who would basically just lash them. And as you can see by this photograph, the people got very creative in the ways in which they would punish slaves. So it's definitely a terrible period of time in American history, but it happened, and we have to recognize that it happened and move forward. Okay. So let's see. obviously there's going to be some pushback, and you're going to see some pushback in the forms of slave rebellion. Slave rebellion. Okay, so it's obviously not an uncommon thing to see slaves want to rebel against their former masters. So one such occurred in 1800, an armed insurrection led by a slave named Gabriel. And as you can see by this on the left, this was in Richmond, Virginia, and it was foiled by informers. Basically, somebody, one of the slaves that was involved, told on them, and all the people who began the insurrection were hanged, and basically left their bodies out to to rot, to show the other slaves this is what happens if you rebel. Denmark Vesey. This is a little. I guess they made a movie about Denmark Vesey. And he was a free black, and he led another ill-fated rebellion in Charleston, South Carolina, in 1822. Once again, Vesey, betrayed by informers, he and 30 of his followers were publicly hung. And then another rebellion was Nat Turner's rebellion. And Nat Turner is an interesting character because he could read a little bit. He was semi-literate. And in 1831, he was a preacher. And he led an uprising of about 60 Virginia slaves, mostly women and children. And, he believed that Jesus spoke to him in his dreams and told him to lead this uprising and go from plantation to plantation, liberating slaves, almost like a modern-day Spartacus. He did not attain anywhere near the success that Spartacus did, as the reprisals against Nat Turner and the women and children who rebelled and their families were very swift and bloody and brutal. So I think it's a terrible beginning, but it's a good start, for a good place for us to stop today, as far as our notes go. And if you have any questions, or I don't mean to bum you out with this stuff, but it happened, it's real, and there's a lot more of it to go. We just started the antebellum movement. But if you have anything you'd like to say, don't hesitate to contact me through Schoology. Send me a message, an email, whatever you need. I'm here for you. So I hope you guys have a great day, and I'll be seeing you soon.